Okay, so the last thing we talked about in class was we were talking about where the first conflict of the Cold War took place. Now, remember, a Cold War is called a Cold War because there's no direct fighting. So there was no clear fighting between us and the Soviet Union. That didn't mean there wasn't conflict, though. After World War II, Germany was divided into four quarters by the Allies. So you can see the blue, the brown, that tannish color near the bottom, and the green. We basically took the country of Germany and divided its land into four territories, four occupation zones. You have Britain in the top left, France in the bottom left, US kind of in the middle, and the Soviet Union to the right. You'll also notice that Berlin is in the Soviet sector. It's in the brown section near the top right. Now, Berlin was the largest and most prosperous city, so the Allies wanted to make sure they had access to Berlin. So what they did was divide Berlin up. And what you can see here are essentially the city limits of Berlin divided again among the four Allied countries. France at the top, Britain's the green, the United States is that mustardy sort of color at the bottom, and the Soviet Union on the right. Now the white around all of this is still technically Soviet territory. It's still technically part of that brown sector from the last map that I showed you. Okay, so you have all of these people living in the white area, which is technically communist controlled, that have Allied influence in those blue, green, and yellow areas. Okay, so in order to stop Western influence on Berlin, Joseph Stalin instituted a blockade. He basically cut off any land access from West Germany into East Germany and subsequently Berlin. If we were to look at the previous map, if we were to go back to that, you'd see that you'd have to get through Soviet territory to get to the blue, green, and yellow portions of Berlin. And what Stalin could do was basically put a blockade all along the western boundaries of the Allied control of Berlin. Okay? We didn't want our supporters, we didn't want our allies in West Berlin starving. We didn't want them to go without necessary supplies, so rather than engage in direct fighting, President Harry Truman used a different approach. He instituted what was called the Berlin Airlift. Okay, in response to Stalin's blockade, in response to Stalin preventing us from having access to West Berlin, Harry Truman helped create and launch an 11-month mission that would bring airlifts of supplies, food, weapons, as you can see here, ambulances. Okay, they would literally fly these things over to Berlin, land on an airstrip in Berlin, drop it off and fly away. And this lasted 11 months. And literally anything the people of West Berlin needed, we had to fly in. So this was a massive undertaking. It was incredible how effective this was. It was incredible how logistically successful they were. Literally, a plane would take off and just minutes later, another one would land. They had it timed to the second. It was quite incredible. Stalin ultimately realizes that the expense of the blockade isn't worth it because we're able to get our stuff to the people of Berlin anyway. So he gives it up. He essentially gives up the blockade, and after 11 months, we are able to use traditional routes to get supplies to the people of West Berlin. The Allies, however, realize that Stalin's not going to make this easy, right? And in order for the people of West Berlin, in order for them to survive, in order for the Allies to be successful there, we knew that we needed to unite with one another. So the Allies come together and they create the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. It's essentially a pact that cements the alliance between these various allied nations. Okay? Now the most important part of this pact, the most important part of this is called Article 5. An attack on one country that's part of this organization would be an attack on them all. Okay? Article 5. An attack on one nation as part of this alliance would be considered an attack on them all. Okay, that was a foundational part of the charter of NATO. Okay, so we see a little bit of tension emerging in Germany. that fizzles out. We see more unity among allied nations. Okay, so we're starting to form this East versus West mentality. Now, the second stage for the Cold War would be Asia. After World War II, Britain and France could no longer maintain their empires there. They got rid of their colonies, just like we did. So you see these empires fading away. That leaves the area vulnerable to the spread of communism. That's why the idea of containment and the domino theory were so important. Okay, so after World War II, Britain and France could no longer maintain their empires in Asia, and what you would end up seeing were a series of revolts, a series of political changes where communist leaders would take power. In 1945, we see this happen in China. Mao Zedong, leader of the Chinese Communists, engaged in a battle for control with Chinese nationalists. So two competing political ideologies are fighting for control in China. We will provide billions of dollars in aid to the nationalists. Unfortunately, it will be a waste because Mao and the Chinese communists would win. Okay, by 1949, Mao would become the chairman of the Communist Party in China. He was Chairman Mao. China has now fallen to communism, and the map sort of looks like that. The red, that's the Soviet Union as well as their spheres of influence in Eastern Europe. The pink is China. So that entire part of the world, and if you'll notice on the left, you'll see Cuba is also in red. It's a little bit later that we'll see that, but it will happen. But you can see from this map just how much communism has spread since the end of World War II. And this is what was terrifying for Americans. Communism was just spreading and spreading and spreading, and there was a genuine fear that it could take over pretty much the whole of the Western world. We were afraid that the Soviets were going to spread the way Nazis did, and that was terrifying for a lot of people. So China happens, China falls to communism, we lose our influence in China. The next stop, Korea. Okay. On June 25th, 1950, communist powers in North Korea invade South Korea. That marks the start of the Korean War. You'll notice on the left, you see the map, you can kind of see India and China and Russia mixed in there. The colored section near the top right, that is where Korea is. Most people think that Korea is sort of down in the center of that map, that it's close to Vietnam, for example. It's not. They're on two very different ends of Asia. The map on the right is a closer view of what North and South Korea looked like. Now, because the communists were able to invade South Korea and spread communism there, it just made things worse for us. We were terrified that we were going to lose another country, that this domino would fall. Truman responds by ordering troops to Asia. He urges the development of the hydrogen bomb. He orders more atomic bombs and short-range missiles be sent to the area. He increases the defense budget from about 14 million to about 50 billion, 14 billion to about 50 billion. And he starts to figure out what we're going to do in case of nuclear war. How will we as a country respond if the Cold War turns hot? And not just hot, but atomic hot, right? A surprise attack at the port of Incheon in Korea will help one of our most famous generals, Douglas MacArthur, break the losing streak that us and our allies were facing in South Korea. Americans will gradually cut off North Korean supply lines, retake the capital of South Korea, Seoul. It's that S-E-O-U-L. You see on the map on the right there. The North Korean war machine will gradually start to collapse. As you can see from this map here, we will ultimately push our offensive all the way up north. It's that green arrow you'll see there. We will push farther and farther and farther and farther north. We will get just about up to the Chinese border. Mao, however, was terrified that we were going to invade. Mao was terrified that the United States, having taken control of North Korea at this point, was just going to keep pushing farther north into China. Truman had no interest in doing that. Truman realized that invading China was a really, really bad idea. They have more people than we have bullets, for example. So Mao, Chairman Mao of China, supplies Chinese forces to North Korea. On November 27, 1950, Chinese forces cross the border between China and North Korea, and they take UN and US forces by surprise. They gradually push them back and back and back. Okay, and you'll see it's that orangish sort of arrow, kind of right in the middle of the map. They will recapture Seoul, that capital city, sort of in the middle of the map there. By January 4th, 1951, Truman at this point is actively considering using the atomic bomb again. He actually figures maybe we should give it a shot, maybe we should try it. But he doesn't have to. Thankfully, by March of 1951, UN forces are able to recapture Seoul and push the North Koreans back up to, you'll see there's a dashed line right in the middle of the map, up to what is called the 38th parallel. The 38th parallel used to be the dividing line between North and South Korea before North Korea invaded South Korea. By the time the war ended, the 38th parallel was the boundary again. Okay, the 38th parallel. Because of the fact that this took a very long time, because it seemed like Truman pretty much just settled for the war to be over, didn't actually defeat the enemy, he loses a lot of political popularity. The election of 1952, then, would go to this guy, Dwight D. Eisenhower. In 1952, Eisenhower would defeat Truman to become president. He promises to end the fighting in Korea without letting it seem as though we had lost, as though we were backing down. July of 53, an armistice is signed. The boundaries of Korea were pretty much exactly where they were at the beginning of the war. The cost, however, 35,000 Americans, 114,000 Chinese, and 300,000 Koreans. So when we talk about the wars of this time period, when we talk about the actual fighting of American forces during this time period, we really didn't do so hot. The Korean War was literally a tie. It was a dead stalemate. The Vietnam War, as you will see, we absolutely lost that one. So the whole Cold War was really not so good for us in terms of our military. Tensions between the two sides of Korea would only continue. We see it to this very day. Now, what's marking American foreign policy with regards to the Soviet Union at this point in our history is a massive arms race. Both sides, both us and the Soviet Union, are fighting to have the biggest, baddest weapon, right? We know that both sides have the atomic bomb. We know that we have a hydrogen bomb. Soviets are developing it. We know that we are both trying to find the best and most effective way to wipe the other off the face of the planet, if so necessary. Both sides believe in what is called massive retaliation, the substantial buildup of hydrogen bombs. In other words, you shoot, we're going to shoot, and pretty much the whole world is screwed. If a war starts, it's going to be the war to end all wars, quite literally. As time passes, the weapons get smaller and smaller, less complicated, meaning other nations can have them, not just us and the Soviet Union. And that's still a problem we face today, right? When we see countries like India, Pakistan, Iran, when we see them developing nuclear weapons, that was something that was once ours. It was ours and the Soviets alone. We were the two strongest countries. And now the fact that other countries could do it, it's kind of terrifying. In August of 57, the Soviets score a victory by creating the first intercontinental ballistic missile. Quite literally a missile that can travel from one continent to another. And Americans are terrified, absolutely terrified. The threat of the atomic bomb was everywhere. It was all the time. It shaped everyone's life. There's actually a video that I will be putting up on the portal for you. It is called Duck and Cover. It's a propaganda film that was created for children to see about what they should do in case of an atomic attack. And it is terrifying and ridiculous and insane, as you'll see. 2 months after the creation of the first ICBM, the Intercontinental Ballistic Missile, the arms race becomes a space race. The Soviet Union launches Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite that is put into outer space. And this was terrifying. This was utterly terrifying. It's one thing to think that the enemy has a weapon. It's one thing to think that the enemy has a missile that can reach your shores really easily. To imagine that the enemy has this thing floating around in outer space that could be above your head at any minute and you would have no idea, it was freaking terrifying, right? And a lot of people started to wonder if we were truly technologically superior. How were we not here yet? How did we not have something like this in our arsenal yet? So America responds by investing very heavily in science and technology education, as well as through the creation of NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. Okay, so I told you at the beginning of class on Wednesday that two sort of trends mark this time period: tension and optimism. The tension was, are we going to get nuked? Are we going to go to war? Are we going to face, essentially the destruction of our species because of this massive retaliation, because of these incredible weapons that we have and that the Soviet Union has? The other thing that went through our country at this time was optimism. Okay, we fully believed that the world could be made better, it could be made safer, and that we were the ones that could do it. To help this along, we see the creation of the United Nations just after World War II. It's an international organization. It's designed to foster discussion among the various nations of the world, hopefully getting involved before war breaks out. It monitors the well-being of just about everybody in the world. They're headquartered, they do have headquarters in New York. They are still active to this very day. The first meeting of the UN takes place on April 25th, 1945. 3 years later, they issue what is called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, principles that would be applied to everyone throughout the world, basic fundamental rights that everyone had no matter where they lived: life, liberty, security of person, equal protection under the law, and it outlaws slavery, servitude, and torture. Okay, so by 1945, we are really showing our muscle as the moral leader of the world. Okay, us and our allied friends. The UN and its principles will also help model foreign policy to this very day. Okay, now on the home front, a lot of people focused on material goods. The war is over. People have money to spend. They start to experience a new style of life, one where they can drive and watch TV and just enjoy being alive. Right? And it makes sense. If you're living perpetually under the fear of atomic attack, you want to live like today might be your last one. And we do see that a lot in the way Americans behaved during the 1950s and into the 60s. When the war first ended, Truman had a premonition that we were going to face some job shortages, that soldiers were going to come home and want to retake their jobs, and that, we might have a bit of a crisis. He proposes a plan called the Fair Deal. It's a 21-point plan. It addresses a whole bunch of topics. It includes issues ranging from employment to wages to housing. Some of the more important parts of the Fair Deal: increases in the minimum wage, making sure that workers were paid enough to actually support themselves. Federal assistance in building homes. That is actually something to keep in mind when we get to another topic a little bit later. The federal government would help you build a new home, not buy an existing home, and we will talk about that momentarily. Federal support for education and health care. So part of this we see in the GI Bill, for example. Soldiers could come home and go to college, and they would be able to do that free, for all intents and purposes. And then jobs in public works. And we've talked about public works pretty extensively before. Putting people to work, helping to develop the infrastructure of the United States. Okay, so we have a few different things that Truman planned on doing to help the American people when they were sort of getting back into the swing of things after World War II. Now, Truman, not super popular. The economy was booming under his watch, absolutely. The gross national product doubles, wages rise, inflation falls. But Truman, I don't know, he's sort of a mixed bag. People liked him, people didn't like him. There were some mistakes made. He has an interesting political history. Now, Americans are able to enjoy life for the first time in a long time. Because if you remember, you have all of the great growth of the 20s, and then immediately we go right into the Great Depression, and then immediately after that we go right into a war. Okay, so for a good 25 years, it seems, 15 years, excuse me, for a good 15 years, Americans haven't really been able to enjoy life. They haven't been able to really just live, okay? The 1950s, however, it changed things. Leisure activities, material goods were available to more people. More than half of all Americans fell into the middle class. They were denied goods during the war, so they ended up saving all their money. Well, now they have money to spend. They're getting paid better, so they have more money to spend. They're not afraid of carrying credit anymore. All of those All of those hardships of the Great Depression are gone. They forgot about them. So they don't have as much hesitation to use credit anymore. Now, two products would shape American life more than any others during the Cold War, the television and the automobile. Okay? By the end of the 1950s, more than 9 out of 10 families owned at least one television, so more than 90% of American families had at least one television. It changed the way Americans relaxed, it changed the way they found their entertainment. When we had just radio, you didn't have anything to look at, so you looked at each other, right? So it was a very communal experience. As you can see from this picture, you have the family together, but nobody's really looking at each other. Everybody's staring at the little box with a picture on it. And we see that time and time again in our society to this very day. Television did provide strong images that people could connect with. It started to create a real national experience. Everybody around the country, whether you were in Maine or California, you were watching the same programs. Okay, the same Saturday evening sitcoms were available to you. And then you have the automobile. The automobile also grows in popularity after the war. By the end of the 50s, about 80% of Americans had at least one car. Okay, automobiles will forever shape our nation in a variety of ways. Create a whole bunch of new industries, including motels, drive-ins, fast food restaurants. People started relying on their cars more, and they didn't need public transportation. So the federal government invests in roads instead of things like trains or subways. That's part of the biggest reason why our rail infrastructure in this country is horrible. But Europe, it's phenomenal. If you want to get from here to California by train, it's not going to be quick, it's not going to be easy, it's not going to be cheap. If you want to get from England to Italy by train, it's not that hard. It's not that expensive. And the trains are super quick. Japan developed the same way. They have those high-speed bullet trains that can travel ridiculous speeds because they invested in that sort of transportation. They invested in the internal improvements that were trains and railways and things like that. We invested in roads because we were a car country. Okay? Because people could commute to work, because people could drive to work, because the GI Bill and the Fair Deal helped people with funding to build new homes, something entirely new develops. Suburbs. By the 1960s, suburbs will take up more space than cities, small towns, or the countryside. The best thing you can possibly envision for suburbs, Family Guy. That is absolutely suburbia. The houses are all very uniform. Everybody knows everybody's neighbor. Dad goes to work, mom usually doesn't. 2 kids and a dog. In Family Guy's case, 3 kids and a dog. If you've ever seen Edward Scissorhands, the movie, all of the houses are exactly the same. They're different colors, but the routine is exactly the same. The moms stay home, the dads leave for work, and everybody leaves at the exact same time. The cars pull out of the driveway all at the exact same time. It's like clockwork, right? Suburbia is very bland. It is very mundane. It is very boring. It is very uniform. Look at the picture. All the houses super close together, and they all look very, very similar. Okay? That is the hallmark of suburbia. And suburbia would really shape American society throughout the 50s and the 60s. There's another extra credit assignment for you on the portal. There's a song called Little Boxes. And it's a song from the 60s. And it has to do with how people got sort of forced into these little boxes. And the little boxes are the houses in suburbia. And if you do that one, I want you to pay attention to the lyrics. Because the lyrics really do have a nice message about what happens to people when they're sort of shoehorned into this type of environment. And their creativity, their opportunity, their interests are often stifled. Now, when we talk about suburbia, there are 5 key trends that will emerge from the spread of suburbia. You'll have to forgive me on your worksheet. There's 5 lines, but there's only 4 circles. Okay, so you'll have to fit 5 in there. My apologies. The first is that we see an end to the non-traditional gender roles of World War II. We talked about how women worked in factories. We talked about how women served in the military. We talked about how women played baseball. All of that goes away. By the end of World War II, by the start of the Cold War, we go back to those very traditional roles. This is what a man does, this is what a woman does. We see an increase in racial segregation. Those houses that I just showed you from suburbia, they were all white. There was a very clear line between where blacks lived and where whites lived, and we'll talk about that in a minute. We see a post-war religious revival. Religion takes a huge growth in the years after World War II. Criticisms of conformity, like I said, all of those houses were exactly the same, all of the people were exactly the same. People start to question if that's the right way to go. Should we be different? Should we be unique? Or should we all just fit into the same little mold? And then you have the lasting environmental impact. Because like I said, the Fair Deal will give you money to help build a new home, not buy an existing one. So if you're going to build a new home, you need building materials, you need land, you need to lay pipe, you need to lay wires for electricity. You're going to rip up the earth. Okay? It's much easier if you move into an existing home, but that's not what the Fair Deal and the GI Bill helped people with. So that is why suburbia grows so quickly. That's why there's such a huge impact on the environment. Now, when we talk about the end to the non-traditional gender roles, when we talk about the role of women in the Cold War into the 1940s and the 50s, we get to that stereotype of barefoot and pregnant. A woman's place is in the home. It is a woman's job to take care of the house, to raise the children, to have dinner waiting for the husband when he comes home after a hard day of work. That was supposed to be life. And a baby boom emerged very quickly. 76 million children were born in less than 20 years. If you have maybe older aunts and uncles, or maybe even your grandparents, if they were born anytime between about 1945 and about 1955, that's really the heat, that's really the high point of the baby boom. And when you see people talking about how things like Social Security, how they'll be essentially depleted by the time you or I get older, when you talk about how people are retiring at this this wave of people retiring, and how pensions are getting more expensive and things like that, it's because of the baby boom. When you have so many people born in such a short time, they're going to follow the same path. They're going to retire at the same time. And the costs that are associated with a person retiring, it's all going to hit our economy at the same time. And we're starting to deal with some of that fallout now. This was the ideal right here in front of you. Mom, dad, 2 kids. There's probably a dog in the backyard. Okay. Society believes that caring for children, taking care of the home, was a full-time job. It should be the center of a woman's life. Look at her. She's thrilled to have a damn frying pan. I mean, come on. This is what they expected life to be like for women. She was supposed to be joyous at the fact that that frying pan is sparkling clean, that her husband is out in the driveway taking care of their beautiful car, right? This was the ideal. It's kind of nauseating, but that was the ideal, okay? If women did work, they had jobs that were traditional for women. Secretaries, nurses, teachers, waitresses. Very few women had opportunities for upward movement. Very few women, got anywhere professionally. And that will contribute to women starting to fight back in the 60s, 70s, and then into the 80s and 90s. African American women do see some positive change. Many are able to move out of domestic jobs and into actual skilled professions. When we talk about women working outside the home, minority women tended to work outside the home more than white women did. So you start to see some changes for women throughout the country during the Cold War. That idea of racial segregation that I mentioned, whites tended to move out of the cities and they tended to move into suburbia, leaving African Americans in many, many urban environments. You start to see racially defined urban segments, ghettos in many cases. We start to see this clear division of where whites live and where blacks live. That's Harlem in the 1950s. Okay, now it wasn't illegal in most northern states, at least, to refuse to sell a house or rent an apartment to someone because of the color of their skin. However, it was sort of an unwritten rule that you just didn't. If you've ever read A Raisin in the Sun. It's a play. You may have had to read it in high school or even for a literature class. There was a movie starring Sean Combs a few years ago. It's basically about an African-American family living in Chicago, and the grandmother of the family gets a life insurance check, and she puts a down payment on a house in a white neighborhood. And one of the neighborhood representatives essentially comes to their home and says, you know, sometimes you're better off living somewhere with people that are like you. And we'd be happy to give you back your deposit so that you can find a home in a place where there'll be more people like you around. Basically saying, you're black, we're white, we don't want you in our neighborhood, get out. Okay, so it wasn't necessarily illegal to do that, but it was sort of an unwritten rule. Realtors didn't show you homes in certain neighborhoods if you were of a certain skin color. Banks might not give you a mortgage if you wanted a home in a certain neighborhood. So it was tough. And we'll come back to this idea of racial segregation in just a minute. The other thing we talked about was a religious revival. After World War II, religion starts to grow in popularity, and we see two lasting changes, two real prominent changes that today we barely even notice, that we think have been there forever, and they haven't been. They've only been there since the 1950s. The first thing is that on our money, you have the words "In God We Trust" added to our money. That is not our national motto. Our motto is E pluribus unum, out of many, one. This was added to our money in the 1950s. The other thing that was added were the words "under God" in the Pledge of Allegiance. If you ever see a textbook, or really anything from prior to 1954, you'll see the Pledge of Allegiance and it won't have the words "under God" in it. That is a very, very new addition, something that people today don't realize is, that recent. You have that crisis of conformity. You have those criticisms of conformity, people saying that, we have to be unique, we have to be individuals, we have to stand out in many ways. Young people question the boringness that was American suburbia. They question how wonderful a society could be, how great could our country be when you have such poverty, such racism, so many environmental issues. But we see this criticism of conformity in movies like Rebel Without a Cause and in books like Catcher in the Rye. Some pretty prominent pieces of media from this generation. And then you also see the environmental changes that I already spoke about. Okay. Politically, what we see in the 1950s is a lot of turmoil. Okay, Truman, like I said, he was a mixed bag. He supported civil rights, which made Southerners not really like him. He was elected for a second term, but his presidency was very uneventful. And like I said, in 1952, Eisenhower became president. Okay, now during his presidency, you have what is called the Second Red Scare. And we've talked about Red Scares before. Whenever we are fearful that the communists might be taking over, or at least that they could take over, it's called a Red Scare. And in our history during the Cold War, there's a few key players involved. Richard Nixon, still a congressman at this point in history, he charges a State Department official with espionage in 1948. He starts to lead this witch hunt against an elected official, against an appointed official, for being a suspected communist. J. Edgar Hoover, director of the FBI during the Cold War. He believed that communists were everywhere. He instructed the FBI to keep tabs on anyone that might be associated with communism, but he also investigated liberals, civil rights workers, homosexuals. He kept files on people, and if there was any sort of suspicion, you better be darn sure he's going to pass that information along, and you're going to be watched, and you are going to be monitored, and it's essentially the earliest version of what we have on a watch list today in many ways. And then there's this guy, Senator Joseph McCarthy. He is probably the most famous from this time period. He claimed that the State Department was infested with communists. He claimed that he had a list of more than 200 communists that existed in the government, but he would never show anyone that list. Ultimately, after countless people were put on trial, after countless individuals had their reputations ruined, it was found out that McCarthy was full of it, that pretty much everything he was coming across was a witch hunt. It was False allegations, completely baseless claims, destroyed lots and lots of people's lives. His tactics were so aggressive, his approach was so aggressive, that we call that response to communism McCarthyism. Okay? If you suspect someone of being a communist, here's what you should do. If you think that your neighbor might be a communist sympathizer, this is what you should do. People were encouraged to snitch on others. And they were encouraged to do so vehemently that they would just turn their back on friends, family, loved ones, you name it. Okay? Americans are pointing fingers at each other. Minorities are very often targeted. People who behave even the slightest little bit differently. Okay? And it's a very difficult time for, free thought and free expression of ideas. Okay? Now, minorities are politically facing some challenges of their own. Under Truman, it looked like progress would be made. He was the first president to address the NAACP at their national convention. He desegregated the military in 1948. He would also serve as leader of this country while other areas were desegregated as well. In April of 1947, Jackie Robinson breaks the color barrier in baseball. April of 1947. Now, the thing that most people don't realize is that when Jackie Robinson traveled with his baseball team, when he was up to bat, when he was playing, people would throw things at him. They would throw garbage on the field at him. He could be attacked by players from other teams. If the team stopped for lunch, if the team stopped for dinner, Robinson might not be allowed in the restaurant that they stopped at. Why? Because segregation was perfectly legal. But he persisted nevertheless. He won Rookie of the Year in 47, MVP in 49, and he was the first African American inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame. Okay, so we are starting to see some major social challenges to the issue of segregation. We also see some legal challenges to the issue of segregation. The landmark case that addressed segregation was Brown versus Board of Education, and I believe we talked about this in class once before. There was a father, he had two daughters that were African American, and they had to travel a good distance to get to school, and to get there they had to travel through a railroad switchyard. So very dangerous, very risky, and they pretty much were passing a white school along the way. And the dad pretty much had enough of it and said, this is crap, we're going right past a school, there's no reason why my girls can't go to this school. So as the Supreme Court does, they would hear appeals of these various laws, of these various cases, and ultimately, in their decision, Brown versus Board of Education, they would rule that separate but equal, that phrase that came out of Plessy versus Ferguson that we talked about a few chapters ago, that was crap. Segregation cannot stand. You cannot have separate but equal. If they are separate, they are inherently discriminatory. They are inherently unfair. Okay, so Brown versus Board of Education will desegregate public schools. That doesn't always mean that the process was easy. In September of 1957, 9 African American students were selected to integrate Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. They are called the Little Rock 9. Clever. 9 African American students who were chosen to forcefully integrate Little Rock High School, Central High School in Little Rock. They were called the Little Rock 9. Okay. These 9 students were met with violent, angry mobs. Look at that woman in the background, right? This girl is just trying to go to school. That's it. She's literally a teenager trying to go to school, and you have these people just treating her like absolute garbage for no reason other than the color of her skin, okay? It got so bad that the governor, Orville Faubus, sent out the Arkansas National Guard to stop these 9 students from being able to go to school. Okay? Despite the fact that the Supreme Court said they could, the governor of Arkansas continued to try to stop them. Eisenhower ultimately stepped in. He sent 1,000 troops from the U.S. Army's 101st Airborne Division to escort those 9 students to school every day for the rest of the year. Quite literally, the National Guard is making sure these kids can go to math class. It's kind of ridiculous when you think about it. Okay? This resistance was absolutely the norm. Okay? Anytime there were any advancements in the civil rights movement, there was a huge backlash. Supporters were beaten, supporters were picketed, mistreated, they could be killed. We see the reemergence of the KKK in this time period. We also see the development of groups called white citizens' councils. They are literally groups of white people that did everything in their power to defend segregation, to keep segregation alive. Look at that flyer. Ask yourself this important question. What have I personally done to maintain segregation? It's ridiculous. It is absolutely insane to think about. Okay? This is really the start of the civil rights movement. This is the thing that would motivate people like Martin Luther King, people like Malcolm X, to move this cause forward. Now, we often say that Rosa Parks is the start of the civil rights movement, but that is not true. The thing that really sparked the civil rights movement was this young man, Emmett Till, and you've probably heard of him. 1955, a 14-year-old boy named Emmett Till was beaten and murdered. He lived in Chicago. Segregation was not as rampant there. He was visiting family in Money, Mississippi. And while he was there, he didn't really keep his behavior in check. Not that he should have to, mind you, but there were certain expectations for behavior of blacks in the South, and Emmett Till just wasn't used to that. He didn't grow up that way, okay? Okay, so here's how it worked. When we don't know the full story, we never will know the full story. The story goes that they were in this store, Bryant's store, and a white woman right there, Carolyn Bryant, she was the only one working in the store. Now, the way the story goes, Emmett Till did something. He whistled, he looked at her and said, "Hey, baby." He touched her. We don't know. We will never, ever know. It depends on who you ask, right? It could be anything, quite literally from physically accosting this woman to just looking at her the wrong way, right? Just looking at her with the tiniest smirk on your face. And that can be interpreted in so many ways by these racist monsters, because there's really no other word. And this next picture is not pretty, but it is something that you have to see, and there is a reason for it, okay? Carolyn's husband and brother-in-law would find Emmett Till. They would take him out of his family's house in Mississippi, literally beat him to a pulp, tie a tractor blade to his neck, and throw him in the river. And that was the result. That is, oh, the picture's a little blurry there on the bottom. My apologies. But that's his head. That's what this young man looked like. The funeral, Emmett's mother made it clear that she wanted to have an open casket funeral. She said, "I want them to see what they did to my baby." And you can see there's a picture of him just at the top of the casket there. It's hard to see from here, but you can imagine that last picture of him, and then that was what the boy should have looked like. Okay, it was horrific, but she knew that if his death was going to serve a purpose, people needed to see what was done. People needed to see what happened to him. The two white men that were accused of the crime were put on trial. They were arrested, they were put on trial in front of a jury. There's the jury. I'll let that sink in for a minute. Two white guys accused of torturing, beating, and killing a young black boy, and that's your jury. That's going to end up fair, yeah? I think so. Okay. So they were tried for murder, and unsurprisingly, and despite the fact that there were plenty of African Americans that said, nope, those were the two guys that took them, we saw what they did, the two men were found innocent. Okay. The jurors quite literally said, when they only took, something like 40 minutes to come back with a not guilty verdict, they pretty much said that it wouldn't have taken that long if we didn't stop to have a pop. They stopped to have a soda, and that's what took them so long to decide that these two men were innocent in the death of Emmett Till. It's horrifying. It is absolutely, absolutely horrifying. I encourage you to read up on Emmett Till because he is so often forgotten in the history of this country. We so often focus on Rosa Parks, and that's fine. She absolutely, is the poster child of the civil rights movement. It's certainly something nicer to look at than poor Emmett Till's face. But it's sad that some people and their sacrifice are lost to history. In 1955, Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat in the whites-only section of a bus in Montgomery, Alabama, and was subsequently arrested. Okay, the African-American community boycotts the bus system, causing them to lose some revenue. Bus companies will hold out until 1956, when the Supreme Court rules that you cannot segregate in public transportation. So it wasn't even the boycott that promoted change, it was the Supreme Court that did it. But it really brought the plight of African Americans, it brought the concerns of African Americans really to the forefront. Okay. By the end of the 50s, it is clear that cultural changes are taking place at the deepest levels of society. The roles of women are starting to change. The roles of young people and how they're questioning society, that's starting to change. The plight of African Americans is becoming front and center in our culture, in our society. And we will then move on to what is arguably the most difficult, the most tumultuous decade with regards to political social change in our country, the 1960s.